How do racial and ethnic minorities fare in Western, mostly white countries? Do they experience prejudice and unfair discrimination? Do they find substantial barriers to social mobility and financial success? Do they find it difficult to succeed academically? Do they find that they are held back by systemic racism and xenophobia? If you were to listen to those who speak the loudest on these issues, to those who create the commonly accepted narratives around race and ethnicity, you would think that this is indeed the case. It's taken for granted that ethnic and racial minorities are treated poorly in the West, or that at a minimum, these countries tend to favor their white populations. But is this true? Do Western countries really treat their white citizens better than their non-white citizens? Are there barriers that keep minorities from achieving prosperity and social advancement? And if this is the case, why do so many people from all over the world try so hard to get into Western countries? Why do these people take such risks to immigrate to these nations? One of the reasons that this perception prevails is that people often overlook some obvious data about the realities of life for non-white people living in Western countries. Take the United States, for instance. Who are the wealthiest Americans? Which ethnic groups earn the most money? Which ethnic groups have the highest household incomes? According to Census Bureau data, white American households have smaller median incomes than Asian American households. But an even more clear picture emerges when we start comparing whites in general to various subcategories of Asians. According to the most recent census, white households have a median income of $74,912. That means that a number of subgroups of Asians are all ahead of whites. And this is outlined on this nice chart that I've provided in this video. For those who want to verify that this data is correct, you can find this on the Census Bureau website. You'll have to scroll down and play around with it a little bit because there's a lot of data there. But you can verify that this is all correct. I think it's important to identify sources, give appropriate credit, etc., and that's why I took some time to show all of this. But this chart is very helpful in answering some of the questions posed at the beginning of this presentation. Very insightful data. And if we look at some of these ethnic groups that are outpacing whites, what you'll find is that many of them are from communities that have a fairly high percentage of recent immigrants. And yet in a short period of time, these people are able to do very well. This is important to point out because there are those who suggest that white Americans have an advantage because for many years they were able to accumulate wealth without experiencing the same discrimination that other groups have had to experience. But that notion is undermined by this data because many of these groups have come here with very little or nothing, and yet in a very short period of time they've been able to outpace white Americans. One of my favorite stats on this chart is that of the Vietnamese immigrants, and that's because that's related to our very difficult experience in the Vietnam War. Most of these Vietnamese immigrants, they've come to the U.S. since the end of that war. That's only about 50 years now. Yet in that relatively short period of time, they've become very prosperous. That's a very good indication of the kind of opportunities that are available to people from all over the world. I will acknowledge that household incomes can be a little bit deceptive. And that's obviously because household sizes tend to be different amongst different ethnic groups. Some ethnic groups will have more income earners per household. However, household income is not the only data that supports these conclusions. If you move over to the Department of Labor and look at median weekly earnings, you'll find again that Asian Americans out-earn whites. And if you look closely, you'll see that it's not just Asians in general, but when you break it down by gender, you'll see that Asian women are out-earning white men, and fairly substantially as well. Once again, though, when we go even deeper and get more into these subgroups, we start to see an even clearer picture. There's a really good economist named Mark Perry from the American Enterprise Institute. He wrote a good article on this topic. The article is entitled Rav Arora's Narrative Destabilizing Essay on a, quote, peculiar kind of racist patriarchy. This is a reference to a different article, which is also a good article, from one of my favorite writers, one Rav Arora. I will talk about Rav in a minute, but Mr. Perry's article here goes into some of the data that I've already provided. His numbers go back to 2019, but I think you'll see that the numbers have stayed relatively constant. When you look at his chart for household incomes, you'll see it reflects some of the same data that I provided above. What I like about his charts, though, and he's got another chart here that's really, really good. In this chart, he compares median earnings for full-time, year-round female workers by ethnicity and ancestry. What I like about this one is that it shows there are a number of categories of women who out-earn white men. And this is important because there is this fashionable notion these days that white people are, quote, privileged, and especially white men. There are those who really like to trash white men. This notion of privilege, there's so much that's wrong with it. I really don't have time to get into all of it here. And I would also say that even if white men were still out-earning all of these groups, I still wouldn't embrace this foolish notion of privilege. However, for those who are obsessed with comparing the relative wealth of different groups between white people and other people and trying to make this privilege argument, this is a very important data set here. This shows that white men certainly are not on top when it comes to earnings. And I think there's a lot to show that white men just do not have the kind of advantages over other people that some would have you believe. And if you look at these subgroups of women, they're not the type of women that you would think would be necessarily favored in our society. I mean, you have Turkish women, you have Iranian women, you have Lebanese women, all doing better than white men. And at a minimum, I think it shows that these simplistic narratives are just not very helpful when we start to try to understand reality. Now, I know some will bring up the fact that these charts show that men out-earn women in general. This goes to the whole myth of the wage gap, the gender wage gap, which has been debunked over and over and over again. And when you start controlling for different factors about the kind of risks that men take on their jobs, men still account for 90+% of workplace accidents. And when you take into account the kind of careers that men go into, it really does explain away the whole gender wage gap. I'm not going to get into that too much because that's not the purpose of this particular presentation. But I just wanted to point that out. There is no gender wage gap. It is a myth. It's been debunked over and over. So that's a discussion for another time. Okay, well, we've compared Asians and whites. What about Latinos and African Americans? Because statistically, they still are behind in a lot of these categories when you compare them to white people. Well, why is that the case? Does that mean that African Americans and Latinos face barriers and prejudice in the United States? Again, I think we have to take a closer look at the data, start looking at subgroups. This was a question that was tackled by Rav Arora. I mentioned Rav a minute ago. One of my favorite writers. He brings the refreshing perspective of an immigrant who is extremely grateful for all the opportunities he's had in the West. He's lived in both Canada and the United States, writes really good articles about these topics. Two of my favorites are as follows. One article is entitled A Peculiar Kind of Racist Patriarchy. It's from December of 2020. The other good article is The Fallacy of White Privilege and How It's Corroding Society. This one's from July of 2020. When he talks about the situation for Black Americans, he gets into the issue of Black immigrants. It should be pointed out that since 1980, more than 3 million Black immigrants have come to the United States. This is really important because you have to ask, if this is a systemically racist country, and if there's all this hostility to Black people, why do so many Black immigrants come here? Not only do they come here, but they come here and they do very, very well. Rav points out how Nigerians and Ghanans, they do very well both in terms of income and in terms of education. In many cases, outpacing whites in these areas. Caribbean Black Americans do very well. This was something that was pointed out by Thomas Sowell in another really good book, another one of my favorite writers, but a book entitled Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And in that book, he compares the success of Caribbean Black Americans, how they've done very well, in many cases outpacing whites in different categories as well. But this is very important again, because if you're trying to look at why some subgroups of people have a hard time, there are certain Black populations in urban centers that fall behind in education, in earnings. But if you want to ask why that's the case, you don't want to misdiagnose that issue. There are those who want to push the systemic racism narrative. And for those of us who push back against it, we'll often be accused of being insensitive to discrimination. But this is really not a fair accusation, because what a lot of us are trying to do, we're trying to properly diagnose a problem. If Black immigrants come to this country and do very well, that's an indication that whatever the struggles are for certain subgroups of people, it's not systemic racism, it's not prejudice, there's something else going on. One factor that Rav Arora points out in this article is the issue of the impact of marriage and how that affects household income. I'm quoting from the article now. It says, in a racial context, the poverty rate among two-parent Black families is only 7.5%, compared to 11% among whites as a whole, and 22% among whites in a single-parent home. In fact, since 1994, the poverty rate among married Black Americans has been consistently lower than the white poverty rate. So having a two-parent household is a good way to avoid poverty. Well, what about the situation with Hispanic Americans? The data doesn't show as much of a decrease in poverty when you have two-parent households, but the situation is a little bit different for Hispanic immigrants because obviously there is the issue of undocumented migrants and the impact that has on their ability to earn a living and to move up in companies, etc. Another issue with Hispanic Americans is that they're a relatively young population. The median age of a Hispanic American is 30 years old, which is pretty young compared to other groups. And obviously, young Americans haven't had as much time to accumulate wealth as other older groups. But still, even with Hispanic Americans, you see that a lot of people from Latin America, they want to come here. And that's an indication that they believe that even for undocumented people, that there is a lot of opportunity in this country. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about the United States, and I did so purposefully because it's the United States that gets criticized the most, and the most unfairly, in my opinion. But what about other Western countries? How do they do when it comes to the issue of racial and ethnic minorities? And even there, I think you'll find that they do very well, that ethnic minorities find a good living, good opportunities for advancement, and that many Western countries are very generous. If you look at Canada and the United Kingdom, you'll see the same situation as the United States, where those who earn the most are typically Asian, typically ahead of whites and fairly substantially ahead of whites in those categories. Not as much on the mainland of Europe. But even on the mainland, you'll find that a lot of those countries, some more than others, of course, but a lot of those countries have been very, very generous with immigrants, with migrants, with refugees fleeing war-torn countries. And in some cases, they've been so generous that they've caused problems within their own populations. This is an ongoing debate, of course, but you certainly can't say that they haven't been generous. In many cases, the people of these countries have put forth the funds to try to house migrants, to try to provide them a good living. They're not always treated with the kind of gratefulness that they should be, and we see sad stories about that on occasion. I think we should also ask the question of how non-white people are able to advance in various Western countries. I mean, if you look at heads of state, for instance, we had Barack Obama as president in the United States. I was not a fan of President Obama's policies, but it is a significant fact that a black man was elected as the president, the highest office in the land. If you look over in the United Kingdom, you have Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of Britain. You've got, in Ireland, you've got Leo Varadkar. He's on his second stint as a Taoiseach, functionally, I guess, like the Prime Minister over there. You have Ramza Yousaf, the First Minister in Scotland. You know, you don't see this kind of advancement in non-white countries. I mean, can you imagine there being a white prime minister of Japan, or a white leader of China, or you go somewhere to like Liberia where you have to be black to even be an immigrant there? And I know when I say this, some people will bring up the past and colonialism when white people ruled over non-white countries, but I'm talking about the modern context. In the modern context, you wouldn't see a white person as a head of state in some place like India or Japan or China or any country in Africa, even in South Africa after apartheid. I couldn't imagine a white person leading that country, not in the current environment. So white countries have been very open to non-whites. Non-whites have found prosperity, they've found opportunities, they've found the ability to advance socially, and in some cases even becoming leaders in the highest offices of those lands. If minorities do so well, why do so many people spend so much time upholding this narrative of oppression? And there are many reasons for that. Some people don't like Western systems of government, or they don't like free market economies. One way to push for revolution and social change is to sell this narrative that minorities are oppressed. And then there's just blatant extortion. and the type of politicians that pander to those who call for this kind of extortion. There are also those who want to hide their anti-white prejudice by calling out so-called privilege. These types of people can hide their resentments behind a fake concern for social justice. But it's not just a question of why this narrative is upheld, but of how it is upheld. It's upheld by focusing on only the very worst aspects of our history and our culture, instead of talking about all the positive attributes of Western civilization. That's why it's so important to confront this narrative with facts. And the undeniable fact of the matter is, when it comes to the advancement of racial and ethnic minorities, the West has done very well. This is a true success story. Instead of trashing the civilization that made these opportunities possible for people all over the world, we should celebrate and defend Western culture. Most importantly, we should avoid embracing foolish and destructive policies in an attempt to solve a problem that doesn't exist.